So do you mind if I unplug your computer here and put something else on it?
That's the group's computer, not mine.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to. If I, theoretically. So, how many of you guys have ever heard of the Energy Foundation? How about Climate Works? How about Greenpeace?
I'll take care of you, Toby.
Okay. So, what's really interesting is obviously if you go to pretty much any bookstore nowadays, you can find a book talking about dark money. Obviously, all of us in this room are a member of a vast right-wing conspiracy or generally affiliated with it. And we're all receiving regular paychecks from, as somebody on the Academy Awards called them, wacky billionaires. Now, I haven't received my paycheck this week, but I'm sure you all have. Now, we joke about the fact that conservatives are often billed as getting tons and tons of cash from these shady organizations. But when you look at liberal money, you're going to find that the shady organizations that exist actually exist on the left. Now, what I'm going to show you right now is Left Exposed. This is what Jim was just talking about. This is actually one of the pages for the MacArthur Foundation. This is one of the top 10 worst liberal foundations in the country. What this does is actively take money from estates. They take money from donors, big money donors, billionaires, millionaires with a left-wing agenda, and they use that money to finance efforts to combat conservative policy. You'll never hear of many of these organizations that you'll find on leftexposed.org. In fact, many of them have such low profiles that their Wikipedia entries are like this big. Now, granted, that's because Wikipedia is kind of in on the deal, but they're deliberately underground. They do more than just, and my two colleagues here on the panel are going to talk a little bit more in depth about this, but they do more than just finance things. They are a clearinghouse for staff. They staff White House. They staff congressional offices. They staff press junkets and lobbying firms and media. They finance operations to talk about policy, to influence policy, to write about policy, to smear conservatives. Anything that they can get their hands on, they will finance. Now, the MacArthur Foundation, from the last tax material we had, was a $323 million organization. In 2013, it took in $430 million. And yet nobody in this room has heard of it. But what you might have heard of is the Smithsonian Institution, the Brookings Institution, the trustees of Columbia University, the University of Chicago, people who do your scientific research, people from whom you get all of your scientific guidance. So, what does a $430 million liberal organization want to do with the University of Chicago? It wants to influence policy. And so at the Heartland Institute, we're tracking all of this money through these organizations, through these central organizations, so that we can find out who the donors are, who the people who are making the decisions are, and who the people who are financing the policy decisions of tomorrow are. Now, when you go to leftexposed.org, you can get all sorts of information: money, power, influence, where people are coming from and where they're going, what the background of all of these organizations are. But you can also get controversies. You can get a clear idea of what each of these foundations who raise all of this money do with that money. In the case of the MacArthur Foundation, how many of you guys have heard of the MacArthur Genius Grant? Everybody's heard of that. How many of you guys think you'll ever get a MacArthur Genius Grant? Maybe Lachlan. Like Lachlan, that's me, yeah, maybe Lachlan. But the MacArthur Genius Grant often goes to people who serve MacArthur's agenda. That $430 million goes to organizations that make decisions that send that money to people who will do what MacArthur wants. Another one that I'm going to look at and show you real quick is the Pew Charitable Trust. Now, like I said, you can go over to leftexposed.org and you can take a look at all of these organizations. But Pew Charitable Trust is another multi-million-dollar organization founded by the Pew family. They're tax exempt, and you think, we've heard of the Pew Research Center, we've heard of Pew Charitable Trust maybe. They do really nice things, some polling once in a while. Well, if you look down a little bit, they have quite a few odd connections at the EPA. Why does Pew want anything to do with the EPA? Well, it turns out that Pew has a really interesting agenda. While Pew started out as a benevolent organization that was just funding random people for being amazing at their research, the people who are in charge of Pew actually have an agenda that has to do with climate change. So they give their money to the EPA gives their money out. One thing you haven't heard me talk about is media, though. I told you that they influence media. Well, how do they do that? That's one of the reasons that I've brought up this particular leftexposed.org profile. This is the Compass Project. The Compass Project is a project of the Pew Research Foundation. It gives money to lots of different small-time organizations, Earth Justice, Eco Trust, Audubon Society, Fish Conservation Networks. These all sound really, really nice, just adorable. Save the whales, you guys. But what they really do is partner with journalists. They bring large journalists from large news organizations, they take them out in the middle of nowhere, and they introduce them to scientists. Scientists whose research fits their policy agenda. Now that sounds kind of shady, right? If you have out in the middle of nowhere, you have a bunch of journalists meeting a bunch of scientists who work for an organization that's pushing a particular agenda, what do you think happens? Those journalists go home, they're doing a story on climate change, and they say, you know, I met this guy from Harvard at this Compass initiative. I'm going to reach out to this guy and talk to him. And so when their stories come out about science, they fit Pew's agenda, and Pew is able to push what it wants onto you. Lastly, and I'll let these guys talk a little bit, you're probably sick of hearing about me, but this is just one of many of these organizations that we're going to talk about today, the Energy Foundation. This is easier maybe to understand because it's very visual. But the Energy Foundation is also a multi-million-dollar organization. But if you look at the top, you have things like Climate Works, Sea Change, Hewlett Packard. These are all also family foundations. Many of them are in trust. Many of them are long-standing foundations. They all give their money to the Energy Foundation because they don't want to be seen as actually giving to liberal organizations. They give their money to the Energy Foundation, and the Energy Foundation provides grants to things like the National Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the people who are on the front lines of environmental activism. So you can get an idea of how people who might not in the public square say that they're actually progressive activists are actually getting a lot of money to on-the-ground progressive organizations without you thinking that they're actually writing a single check. Now, these two guys here are way smarter than me. They're going to talk to you about some in-depth research that both of them have done, and please give a hand to John Hankey. We're going to let him up first.
Thank you. I was expecting to go after Lachlan, at which point everything would have been covered and I could have kept it short and got right to the food. So first of all, I want to make it clear that I'm not condemning foundations, donors, privacy, or activism. The problem is not with their existence. The problem is with the double standard that exists. Donors and activists on the right are special interest, while donors and activists on the left are public interest. Well, the activists are anyway. The major donors on the left rarely receive any attention at all. You're all familiar with the story of the lady who said that the earth is carried on the back of a turtle. And when somebody asked her what was underneath the turtle, she said, it's turtles all the way down. The more I've looked into the money machine on the left, the more I've realized it is foundations all the way down. Everybody hears constantly about Kochs, Koch Institute, Koch Foundation. There is an enormous amount of ink spilled over the Koch's influence in politics. But if you were to look at the top 100 foundations by giving, as of 2013, when the latest data is for, you see Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the top with $3.3 billion in annual giving. The next down is much lower than that, but still, Ford Foundation at $560 million in annual giving. Now, much of that goes to worthy causes, things that are unobjectionable, but of course, when the Koch brothers give to a ballet or a museum, it's a controversial ballet or museum. You never, ever hear of the enormous number of things that are funded by the Ford Foundation, or the Hewlett Foundation, or the Foundation to Promote Open Society, or the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, all of which give well in excess of $300 million a year. In fact, there are at least 10 left-of-center foundations that give well in excess of $100 million every single year. So Koch, where do they rank? Not in the top 100. While much foundation giving goes to these unobjectionable causes, a great deal of it goes to overt or covert political activism. They don't explicitly support candidates or directly lobby for legislation, so this massive funding doesn't get counted in most discussions of political giving. But make no mistake, foundations fund full-spectrum campaigns. For many years, foundations were hesitant to influence public policy. That changed in the 1990s when a number of foundations embraced a more what's called directive model of funding, where the foundations decided the direction and they gave grants to organizations that would implement their goals. The full policy campaigns include a variety of things. Research, fundamentally. They would fund academics or schools, sometimes even draft academics to design the strategy and tell them what they should be doing, what they should be funding, what their policy and political goals should be. They would, of course, fund activism that you know about, the C3, C4 groups, MoveOn.org, Free Press, US PIRG. But also they fund a great deal of media. There's, of course, the obvious, but often overlooked, NPR, PBS, and local public media stations, as well as the variety of other public broadcasting entities, which, by the way, frequently work in very much policy collaboration with them. There's an enormous amount of niche media targeting specific communities or groups. The Ford Foundation has funded the LA Times and the Washington Post directly, funded the Washington Post for at least $500,000, a $500,000 grant to cover money in politics. Not, of course, the Ford Foundation's money in politics. They also create groups like Upworthy, which is a very, very successful social media sharing media organization, which is explicitly run by activists. The result is a circle jerk campaign. Foundation-funded academics release research, which is promoted by foundation-funded activists and covered by foundation-funded media. It's foundations all the way down. While corporate involvement in the marketplace of ideas is condemned, foundation involvement is welcomed and encouraged. The activist groups don't call the shots, though. Our real opponents are the billionaire operations behind the activist groups. These efforts are strategic, they're disciplined, they're focused, they utilize all the elements of a traditional political campaign. Foundations are quietly laundering their influence through advocacy groups, academia, and alternative media while aggressively pushing for more transparency, openness, and disclosure from the private sector that they attack. Foundations think, plan, and act for the long term. While many on our side plan for the next quarter or the next year, foundations plan for decades. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, many Democrats believed that campaign finance reform was, to quote Ellen Miller of the Sunlight Foundation, formerly, the reform that makes all other reforms possible. As a result, a few liberal foundations, largely led by Pew's directive funding model of political activism, spent $123 million to manufacture a campaign for campaign finance reform. As Pew's program director for the Campaign Finance Reform Project said, the idea was to create an impression that a mass movement was afoot. Everywhere they looked, in the academic institutions, in the business community, in religious groups and ethnic groups, everywhere, people were talking about reform. After the passage of McCain-Feingold, many of the foundations and activists turned the new foundation directive funding model in new directions, including progressive infrastructure development, media reform, and particularly technology policy. Today, many of them have become frustrated by their lack of progress and are explicitly turning back to campaign finance reform. One of the leaders, Larry Lessig, has argued for CFR as a means of reducing the cost of getting the policies they want. To quote, "You go to the environmentalists and they tell you the hundreds of millions of dollars they organized and spent to get global warming legislation, and they got nothing. And you say to them, if money didn't buy results in Washington, how much would it have cost to get global warming legislation? And they begin to think, geez, 1/10, 1/20th of what we actually deployed would have been enough to educate lobby policymakers to get to the right position." Foundations do not, of course, act alone. They routinely collaborate with companies, with venture capitalists, and with hedge funds, and with government agencies and public broadcasters, who all find a great deal of value in laundering their advocacy through these public interest groups. The new model of left-wing activism has never gotten the exposure routinely given to the so-called special interests on the right. As Pew Charitable Trust Program Officer Sean Treglia said in 2004, if any reporter wanted to know, they could have sat down and connected the dots, but they didn't. Journalists didn't care. They didn't know, they didn't care. They didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know about the sector, so no one followed up on the story. The goal in very, very broad terms is to control the information environment. So foundations have shifted from to campaign finance reform, which they believe is necessary to get their other reforms, media policy, which they believe is necessary to generate the media environment that is helpful to them, and often technology policy, which is becoming the master policy because it affects everything else, so much else. Foundations collaborate frequently with other foundations. You will routinely see the same foundations. In fact, of the 8 foundations that funded the campaign finance reform movement, 6 of them went on to fund the same projects in the technology policy space. They also collaborate with government entities like USAID, the State Department, the Broadcast Board of Governors. And of course, academics, which you will routinely see, but they will vary by sector. In the energy sector, you'll see the same academics. The tech policy sector, the same academics, and the same thing in the campaign finance reform sector. I'll cut it off for now since I don't want to step on your space. Lachlan.
Thank you, John. So while Jim is getting this technology situation worked out, I just want to, I think it's important to be clear on the specific terms that we're talking about and the specific types of groups. So I want you to think about 3 different types of groups. The first are the foundations, which have been very well thoroughly covered. The second are 501c4 groups, and this is what we generally mean when we refer to dark money groups. These are nonprofit organizations. C4s refer to sort of advocacy. Technically, they're called social welfare groups, and they basically can, unlike their nonprofit counterparts like the Heartland Institute, among other organizations, they're permitted to spend money on lobbying, and they're permitted to spend money on issue advocacy. So that means that they can run ads on TV, and they can't tell you vote for or against a certain candidate, but they can mention a candidate's name. This is a post-Citizens United development. Mention a candidate's name and say, call Congressman so-and-so and tell him, kicking puppies is wrong. Or something along those lines, something designed to convey a certain message about that politician. So very often when we talk about dark money, if it's referred to as a negative, very often, that's coming from the perspective of these are groups that are surreptitiously spending money on elections. They're not required to disclose their donors because ostensibly they're operating for the advancement of social welfare. So you could take issue with that or not, but that's the reality at the moment. And then the third type of group are political groups, super PACs, campaigns to a certain extent, but that's very limited in terms of how much money you can give to a candidate committee. But think super PACs, 527s, organizations like that. So I pulled up here, this is the opensecrets.org is really a tremendous site if you're researching this kind of stuff. They have a lot of data on political money and the like. So this is a list of the top donors to that third category, to political groups, in the 2014 election cycle. So for all we hear about the evil Koch brothers and conservative donors, look at the totals here. And I am not able to expand this window for some reason. There we go. Tom Steyer, number 1. You may or may not have heard of Tom Steyer. He's the basically the leading money man for Democrats right now, big-time environmentalist. He's worth about $1.6 billion. and he gave $73,725,000 to outside spending groups. The next biggest is Michael Bloomberg with a little over a third of that. And you start looking at these numbers, and it becomes very clear how one-sided donations were to that category of political groups in 2014. Now, it's a little more even this cycle, and that mainly has to do with the number of Republican candidates we've seen that are taking advantage of super PACs in this very competitive primary cycle. I think you're going to start seeing much larger checks being written to groups supporting Hillary Clinton and the like. Now, there's another thing you'll notice about, has anyone heard of the Democracy Alliance here? Anyone know that name? Yeah, so no one really knew who these guys were until very recently. And they are basically a donor club. So for $20,000 in dues and a minimum $200,000 commitment to their portfolio of groups, you get access to like-minded millionaires and billionaires who want to finance the same sort of left-wing groups that you do. So some of these names, when you start researching the Democracy Alliance, will start to look familiar. Tom Steyer is a Democracy Alliance partner. Fred Eichner is a Democracy Alliance partner. George Soros is a Democracy Alliance partner. Donald Sussman, Amy Goldman. And I found this out through a lot of research and reporting on the Democracy Alliance, starting with this piece back in 2014. When we stumbled on some documents that revealed the full scope of the organizations that they were supporting. So I pulled up those documents here so you get a sense, and I'm sorry about the grainy resolution here, but it's about 20 organizations that they support every year, and they cover the full spectrum. You can see, here's a good example, America Votes. We're going to come back to this one. 501c4, the Dark Money Group, and they have a super PAC. The American Constitution Society, they're pushing extremely hard right now trying to get the Senate to confirm a Supreme Court nominee. 501c3, Black Civic Engagement, Catalyst, this is the big data warehouse for Democratic candidates that was created during the Clinton years. Center for American Progress, most of us know. Media Matters is down here somewhere. There they are. So you get a sense of sort of the broad array of organizations they support. And I have created actually, this is my personal website here. It's #Laughlin.com. And there are a lot of research tools here that I've compiled. If you go to #Laughlin.com/research, and one of them, which I've already brought up here, is a full list of the Democracy Alliance partners that I've sort of put together over the past couple of years. And you can see, you'll notice, you'll recognize some of the names on here, most of them you will not. We've put together, 86 different partners. So they have individual donors, they have foundations that donate, they have labor unions, and all these groups and individuals are required to give 6 figures every year to groups in their portfolio. So I just wanted to sort of make you aware of them because this is sort of the biggest clearinghouse of left-wing money on the scene right now. And they've doled out in total probably $600 or $700 million to organizations since their founding in the mid-2000s, and they're only going to get bigger over the next few years. Now, I kind of wanted to give you a demonstration of how I use some of these research tools, how you can use them, and I think doing so will give you a good sense of how the money flows through those 3 different types of organizations that I mentioned at the beginning. So let's say you want to find out, and I pulled this up on beta.fec.gov, which is the new Federal Election Commission data website, which I can't recommend highly enough. It's really good. But I've pulled up the page here for Priorities USA Action. This is the biggest super PAC backing Hillary Clinton at the moment. Let's say you want to see who is donating to Priorities USA Action. Well, there's some familiar names on here. We got George Soros, Steven Spielberg, Jeff Katzenberg, another big Hollywood guy. Cheryl and Haim Sabin are longtime Hillary donors. But this one really jumps out at you right at the very top, right? Fair Share Action. That sounds so innocuous. So let's say you want to find out a little more about Fair Share Action. Well, you can see there's a little link here, so you can click on that and it will bring you to this page, Fair Share Action's FEC page. And if you go to, here, let me, so it'll bring you to this page. You want to see who's contributed to them. So we're still tracing the money here. We don't know where this money is coming from. So we'll go to their receipts data, get rid of this, And it's loading. So they've received just 2 donations this cycle, 2 very large donations from Fair Share Inc. and Environment America. That doesn't really tell us much more. Well, through another service that I use a lot, unfortunately it's subscription only, but it's extremely powerful if you're doing this type of research. It's called Foundation Search. So I've gone ahead and punched in Environment America into Foundation Search Grant Analyzer here, Grant Visualizer. This is going to tell me all the foundations that have donated to Environment America. So once again, we're tracing this one more step here. So you see all these, a lot of foundations here. Tides Foundation, of course, is one of the biggest ones on the left. Sierra Club. Sea Change, though, I wonder what the Sea Change Foundation is. Let's see, 240,000 here, 148,000 here. So let's say you want to find out what's going on there. Well, you can go to this really great website, foundationcenter.org. They have this 990 finder. Now, every nonprofit, 501c3, 501c4, 501c6 trade associations are required to annually file these 990s. So we punch in Sea Change. And there's the Sea Change Foundation. And let's see what we can find this year. Well, I've already pulled up this 990, but I'm just showing you how I got there. They are very nice and list some of their donors. That makes it much more, it's very helpful for our purposes. So Nathaniel and Laura Simons. This is a guy by the name, he goes by Nat Simons, big hedge fund guy out of San Francisco, literally drives a yacht across the San Francisco Bay to work. I know because I went and took pictures of him getting on and off of it. And so there are all these trusts in his name here. So he's basically financing this group. But then you scroll down and there's this weird group, Klein Limited, and they're from Bermuda. That is pretty shady. Now, I can tell you, because I did God only knows how many hours of research on this, that there is nothing online about this group. But I ended up getting in touch with someone at the Registrar of Companies in Bermuda. Now, they're obviously not too keen on sharing information about these shell companies, the thousands that are, incorporated there, to precisely shield prying eyes like mine. But I was able to find out that the executives listed on these incorporation documents are also executives of funds that are investing in Russian oil companies. So we've now gone through 5 steps of following the money here, and we can trace money being spent on Hillary Clinton's behalf in this election to Russian oil interests. And this is the kind of stuff that you really only can find with hours and hours of research and the type of public document tools that you're going to find on this website right here. So I've broken all these down. I highly encourage everyone to dig into it themselves. I think it's a lot of fun. Most people don't like scrolling through hundreds of pages of FEC documents. I find it fascinating. I don't know why. But there's so much information out there. And you know what? I'm going to show you one more thing, because this gives you, so on the one hand, Russian oil interests financing Hillary Clinton indirectly. If there are any American bridge trackers in the room, I'm not suggesting that Hillary Clinton is taking money from Russian oil interests. But on the other hand, you remember I mentioned that vote, that Group America votes. So I want to give you a sense of how micro these efforts get as well. One hand, biggest super PAC in the presidential election. On the other hand, and this is based on some more research I've been doing recently, I checked out, this is Colorado has a really great campaign finance website. The data is really easy to find there. So I very often will go there when I'm looking for stories on state level stuff. And I punched in America Votes into their contribution. You could search by contributor, which is really great. And this comes up. And you can see that they're financing all these very innocuous sounding front groups throughout Colorado. Fairness for Colorado, they're literally financing school board elections. This is like the biggest lefty donors in the country are trying to sway Colorado school board elections. So this gives you a sense of, these guys are very determined, and no race is too small for them. They understand the implications of, the redistricting process, things along those lines. And they're really getting involved on a very micro level, in addition to financing some of the largest, household name organizations that we know. So this gives you, this is just a small snapshot, and once again, I would encourage everyone to explore some of these research tools that are available, and yeah, happy to take any questions you have. Thanks.
So do you want us to here and take questions? And...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Right there. Yeah. Can you come up to the microphone, or otherwise I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
The 990s are behind a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yes.
We get more current.
You can't, unfortunately.
You want to come up here?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the question was the 990s for nonprofits. Obviously, they're only required to be filed annually, and they're generally filed, in like July or August of the year following the year that's being reported, and then it takes a little while for them to be publicly available online. So there's not much you can do there, unfortunately, and you just have to know when those deadlines are. And off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you when they are. And just be ready, knowing when they're going to drop, and you can sort of be the first one on that story or with that information. But unfortunately, in between those periods, there's a serious lack of information about your nonprofit groups.
There's also a process by which 990s can be delayed. So they're usually due in February of most years, and then some organizations can delay them to October. Some organizations have assessments and they delay them even further. So it's also a shell game. One of the things that we've tried to do with the Left Exposed website is take a lot of what Lachlan is doing and try to put it in a way that, it's kind of bloggy, so you get a sense of where it's coming from and get a good start on it. But yeah, it's a shell game with 990s because they have the opportunity to do all of these weird little things that delays it, especially in an election year. So.
Let me add one other thing. If you go to the operation that you're looking for their 990, they have to give you a 990. Now,
said that.
Yes.
Straight to.
So there are different 990s that you will find. Sometimes organizations will upload their own 990 with the things redacted that they want redacted, so that when somebody goes looking, that's the one they find. That's not necessarily the only 990 that's available, so you can look for different services. GuideStar has them, the ones Lachlan mentioned. Sometimes just do searches for some of the things that are on their 990, and you'll find an unredacted version online. I found one activist group that had the redacted versions posted to all the official places, and an unredacted version uploaded to a probably unaware to a online account that they were probably unaware had been shared publicly. So if you look, often you will find different versions of the same 990.
And if you're interested in something that's going on in your state, and I think state level politics is where it all really starts. If you live anywhere near the State House, you can go to the State House, you can get copies of them. Often if you call the State House, they'll tell you how much it is to get the copies, when you can get the copies, whether you can get the copies. It's all a matter of just making a lot of phone calls, which is hard in this day and age. I'm a millennial and I don't like to pick up the phone, and that's just a thing I do. But if you do that, it can get into your hands very quickly.
Hi, I'd like to briefly address this for a moment from the standpoint of one of the people that goes and knocks on doors. When you're looking for a job as a conservative activist, you'll very quickly find out there's about 20 jobs as a liberal activist for every one as a conservative activist, and they pay much better. And this goes a long way towards explaining how that is. So obviously these left-wing groups have mounted a very concerted effort over a long time to capture these foundations and then created this infrastructure. So why don't we do the same thing and start taking over these things ourselves? We probably outnumber them 4 or 5 to 1. What can we do to pursue this same sort of strategy?
Well, I mean, just my opinion is that our billionaires are generally a little more siloed and a little less, they're more hesitant to share what they consider, proprietary information, or collaborate on efforts like that out of this sort of misguided sense of, hanging on to the elements of whatever political infrastructure it is that's theirs. And contrast that with the stuff about the Democracy Alliance I mentioned, where it's very decentralized and very collaborative. I mean, as far as infrastructure goes, a lot of these institutions we're talking about were built in response to things that the right had done, and places like the Heritage Foundation and organizations that were set up in the 70s and 80s and were very successful. So we've done it before. I mean, I wish I knew what the answer was. I just think that there's people tend to be a little more, well, they tend to want to share what they have a little less on the right, for better or for worse. And you see a lot of very sort of siloed, separated organizations operating side by side rather than collaborating. So I think more collaboration would go a long way towards doing that.
And I think to some extent that's necessary on the left, because they do have more competition among the massive foundations. I mean, like I said, you have at least 10 foundations, left of center foundations, that have annual donations over $100 million a year. There's much more pressure to collaborate to make the money work together than there probably is on the right, with fewer centers of power, as it were. I'm sorry. I don't
no, it's okay.
One more thing. A lot of the money on the right, it seems to me, has a very short-term focus. Very, what's going to happen in this next financial quarter? What's going to happen this year in this congressional session? A lot of it goes towards explicit campaign-oriented activity instead of long-term movement building. Democracy Alliance, that he was talking about in 2012, said most of their money was going towards organizing and research. There's nothing like that in terms of focus on organizing and research on the right at that level.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a business aspect of that too. Do right-leaning organizations need to go out and pound the pavement to get names on a street corner? That's not necessarily true. Right-leaning organizations do a very good job getting them online. They do a very good job of getting them in other arenas. So in order to justify expending money on something like that, you actually have to see a return on investment. And I think that business, especially business leaders who make up the core of Republican donors, do want to see an ROI on something like that, and they don't necessarily see that, whereas people on the left do. One thing that I have found too is that left-wing organizations are often demanding of a certain tunnel vision. So everybody is on board. People go to somewhere like Democracy Alliance and they tell them, this is what we want to do, this is how it's going to be, this is what you're donating money to. And often on the right, you have donors who will donate to something and they'll say, I want my money to go to X. And so there's a different donor management systems, and it works differently for both. I think it's, different strokes for different folks, I think is the.
Anyway, I'm a lot more depressed having come to this meeting. And I can see why people don't have faith in their government, because it seems like it's being controlled by special interests on both sides of the aisle. Because this kind of shenanigans, I'm sure, has existed whether Republican or Democrat. So having said that, how do we stop this? Because we wonder why, people feel the way they do. There's got to be some way to stop it. I'm sure over the course of the years that the government could have done, but it seems to me the politicians are benefiting on both parties. So,
well, to some extent, the answer is you don't. To some extent, the answer is you don't. Foundations are free to donate money, and just like everybody else. But instead of stopping it, the goal should probably be to expose it, to make people aware of it. There have been efforts in the past to term limit foundations, as it were, to require them to pay out the principal within 20 years. Those went nowhere. I don't know that those are the right answer. But to the extent that we believe in free speech, we believe it on the left as well, but we should demand more transparency for it.
I don't want to tell somebody that they can't give money to something that they really believe in, because I want to give money to something I really believe in. But there's, what we had talked about is the double standard. Everyone's always like, we need to find out where all the dark money is coming from on the right. Well, we also need to find out where it's coming from on the left. You don't get to force somebody to expose their donors and then hide yours. If it's about free speech, it's about free speech.
Okay, as if this wasn't depressing enough, I was wondering who in the room has heard about actblue.com.
Yep.
Not very many. They're closing in on $1 billion raised. And so my own 2 cents here is I've been trying to form an organization on the right side to do the same thing. We've gotten nowhere. We can't convince Republicans the need for it. The party establishment doesn't really like us because we might be out there working against their favorite candidate. And check out ActBlue. It's an incredible source. They're hitting $1 billion soon. They fund everything from the local races, school board races, right up to, they're big on the Bernie now this year. So anyway, if anyone wants to talk about what we've been up to, I'll be around here. Billy Johnson, we're going to start in Wisconsin and move on. So, but, move on, that's a bad word. Anyway, yeah, any comments on ActBlue and that and their success? I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. They do also put out something called the Blue Book, which you can buy and Amazon, and it'll show you, well, if you buy it on Amazon, you're funding crisis. But the Amazon, you can buy the Blue Book, and the Blue Book will actually list almost all your retailers, so Macy's, Marshall Fields, all those kind of things, and it'll give you a sense of exactly who your retailers give money to, and that's so that people can go out and spend money specifically at progressive retailers, but it can be used for other purposes as well.
I have a two-part question. The first part is there any established link between CNN, MSNBC, and these liberal groups? And the second part is, can you find a way to funnel the money that is provided by conservative funders to conservative outlets like One American News Network or Fox News?
Well, I think there's been sort of, on to your second point, second question, a renewed emphasis on nonprofit news ventures on the right, and certainly the Free Beacon started as a nonprofit. We went for profit last year, and we had donors, and I think the Daily Caller now has a nonprofit arm, and the Heritage Foundation's Daily Signal obviously run out of a nonprofit. So there are more resources being put into organizations like that. As far as I think the cable networks linking to these groups, I wouldn't be surprised if their executives were large donors to a lot of these organizations. None occur to me off the top of my head. Maybe you guys know better than I do, but very often, I don't think you're going to see a CNN political action committee donating to a left-wing organization, but I'm sure a lot of these executives are big donors for sure.
Many of the hosts on MSNBC are activists in their spare time.
If you want to find out, though, Open Secrets, that website I pulled up, has a great little donor search tool, and you can search by employer. So just punch CNN or NBC or whatever it is in there, and every donor who lists that as their employer will pop right up. So
your best bet is to just make a lot of money and then take over another network instead of funneling into a different, another network. And all these organizations do great work. But, if you really want to make an impact on media, either fund somebody going into journalism school, pay for scholarships, pay for training so that they can get an ability to withstand sort of the influence that comes with J School, help them get a job once they're out there in the mainstream media, and then make a lot of money and buy CNN.
Hi, first I want to congratulate you guys on this excellent presentation. It's really an eye-opening thing, and I hope that you have it online somewhere so people can see this. I would love to push that out on my Facebook page. The second thing was, I'm not sure that my question was really well answered. I can see that the leftists made a concerted effort over decades to capture these foundations, such as Pew and so forth. I think that what we need to do is to organize to try to recapture them for our side and put them to work for good. It's not so much that I want to create competing organizations. I want to capture theirs.
I suspect, and I'm speculating here, please step on my toes if you disagree, but I suspect that's something you can do once, but what's the saying? You can rat, but you can't re-rat. Once something has been taken over by a very ideological force and moved away from the original purpose, the new people in control will be very watchful of a coup happening again. I think it would be very, very difficult for conservatives to take over the Ford Foundation, for example.
Yeah, and Ford and most of these big foundations are family foundations. Ford, the Hewlett family, the Packard family, the Soros family. So, obviously that's a very tight-knit circle that's going to be very hard to make inroads in, especially if you're coming at it from an ideologically opposed perspective, I think.
Especially Pew. Pew started out as a very conservative organization, and then, people got close to the family, the Pew organizations consolidated, and then it flipped. So it's very much about people getting close to these organizations and then taking over once the family decides, either they pass away or they move on. So, if you really wanted to do that, I guess start becoming best friends with some of the people who are at the top of the Pew organization.
I should add, though, that a lot of these organizations are being run by the children or grandchildren of the tycoons that provided the money that they are now using. So Ford, obviously, Rockefeller, these were titans of industry who I'm sure did not share their descendants' views when it comes to, say, carbon emissions. So, there is hope and also risk in future generations taking over those organizations. And so the extent to which, we can sort of promote conservative ideas generally and just sort of hope that the next generation of thinkers who takes over these organizations are more amenable to the ideas that we have. So.
Okay, we can take the last two questions if we can do it quickly.
Sure. So just wondering, how do you reconcile the fact that most liberals want to stop the influence of big money into politics with the fact that you have evidence of all this liberal money putting it, like, it kind of contradicts itself. So I was wondering what you think about that.
They are perfectly happy to live with the contradiction. Yeah. They are very aware of the contradiction, and it doesn't bother them, mostly because nobody points it out, or it's very rarely pointed out.
The only time you ever hear somebody say, I don't want big money in politics, it's because it's big money they're not getting. The check isn't going to them.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, which is why when the Disclose Act, the legislative sort of rejoinder to the Supreme Court after the Citizens United decision, when that was crafted in Congress, it applied to, Citizens United freed up rules for corporations and labor unions, and Disclose Act only targeted the corporate side of it, not the labor side of it, which is as big, if not bigger, source of money in politics. So, they're pretty blatant about it sometimes. It's not money in politics that liberals oppose, it's conservative money in politics. So.
And it's happened twice this election cycle. So Howard Dean actually went on TV and he said, unions are basically our version of the Koch brothers.
Right.
There are big money people. And then also, if you actually look at the super PAC disclosures, now that Jeb Bush is out of the race, the largest super PAC recipient of super PAC Citizens United related money is Hillary Clinton, which is ironic because Citizens United was fought to allow an organization to actually attack Hillary Clinton by name. But she is the largest super PAC recipient this cycle. Just have time for one more.
Okay. Quickly, I know there was a recent lawsuit for the IRS to move quicker on digitizing 990s. Has there been any update on that?
I don't know, but I'm definitely intrigued by that. That would be fantastic.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't say.
Second, I've seen a lot of articles recently on how the right is using LLCs to funnel donations. Is that a tactic the leftists use at all, or is it because it just seems the media is focusing on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of, LLCs, the reason that they do that is because there's virtually nothing that is made publicly available about what they do, so by its nature it's very difficult to figure out the scale of that. But, Catalyst, for instance, that data company I mentioned is an LLC. We'll never know really what's going on behind the scenes there. And I think more campaign committees are doing that too. So, yeah, I think it's sort of across the board. We're seeing that more and more.
And the left also uses a lot of what are called donor-advised funds, which is a foundation that is allowed to pass through money and pass it based on the donor's interests. So if I gave $1 million to the Ford Foundation, Ford can do whatever they want with it. But if I gave $1 million to Tides, which is donor-advised, I can say, I want that $1 million to go to Emily.
Thank you. I'd love Tides money. That'd be great.
I'll get a kickback on that.
20%.
I can say I wanted to go to Emily, and they would then pass that through. And, of course, that's a great way of laundering money so that it could be given by Acme Corp, and you have no idea because it looks like Tides.
Can I get in a quick final question? Donald Trump says he's a conservative, and he's got a huge fortune. It's just huge. I mean, he's worth billions, he tells us. But other than $50,000 to the American Conservative Union, which has invited him to speak here, and $25,000 to the American Spectator Foundation.
That didn't happen.
Yeah, it's in his Donald J. Trump Foundation returns, ma'am. You better do your research. Has he given any of his vast fortune, to your knowledge, to any other conservative groups?
Not that I know of. Certainly not as much as he gave to the Clinton Foundation. So.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm not aware of anything either. No.